This is the Nikon Zf, a powerhouse of a camera packed into a retro film camera body modeled after the Nikon FM2. It's been out for about 6 months now, but most of the reviews here on YouTube were just initial impressions. So instead, I've been shooting with it for the last few months to really get to know it. As a longtime Sony shooter, I have to say I have thoroughly enjoyed the experience, but I'm still left wondering, who is this actually for? Well, let's find out. Okay, so let's first talk about things that I really enjoy about this camera, then I'll get into some of the things that are still kind of driving me a little bit crazy. After that, I'm hoping that we can come to a conclusion on who should actually buy this thing. A quick disclaimer. Nikon was kind enough to loan me the Nikon Zf for a few months, but I don't get to keep it, they don't have any say in what I say, and they don't get to see this video before you do. First and foremost, we have to talk about the build. This thing really does feel a lot like a film camera. Fuji's may look the part, but often they don't really give you that same feeling. The Zf really has a heft and a weight to it with its metal body and its brass dials. I've even seen some folks accelerate the patina process and it looks awesome. The soft shutter release is incredibly pleasing and allows you to add a shutter release button, plus the shutter itself sounds so nice. Nowadays, with electronic shutters and mirrorless cameras, many companies are just playing a shutter sound through a speaker, whereas this gives you a nice solid flap. Like here, listen to the Zf. Then have a listen to the Sony A1. I mean, which do you prefer? This isn't necessarily the exact same as a film camera, but I really enjoy the EVF. It's only 3.6 million dots, the same as the Z6 II and the Z7 II, but when you look through it, it feels really nice and bright. So many cameras at that around $2,000 price point kind of cheap out when it comes to the EVF, so it's awesome to see that the Zf is not. I also really love the dedicated black and white switch on the Zf. Could you easily achieve a black and white LUT with almost every other camera? Sure, but having a dedicated switch to quickly swap back and forth makes it so effortless to shift your shooting mindset to black and white and focus on nothing but tonality and composition. Having shot with almost every Sony camera since the original A7, I've always appreciated that they continue to innovate on the functionality of their cameras. However, they are a bit sterile and formulaic. They do everything that they're supposed to do, but one thing that the Sonys tend to lack is a soul. The Nikon Zf, on the other hand, well, it certainly has a soul. Now, where film cameras force you to slow down, the Nikon Zf absolutely does not. It has the Xpeed 7 processor, so the same as the Z8 and the Z9. By comparison, the Nikon Z6 II has dual Xpeed 6 processors, which, as I understand it, those combined are still only about a fifth as fast as a single Xpeed 7. All of this makes the camera incredibly snappy. At startup, reviewing your images, all very responsive. Where it gets really impressive is the autofocus. As I mentioned, I'm primarily a Sony shooter. I don't think it's really up for debate at this point that Sony is currently the leader in autofocus technology. But I also try to shoot with a lot of other cameras, and each time I'm like, okay, yeah, this technically works fine, but I miss my Sony. The Nikon Zf is the first time where I haven't felt that longing for Sony autofocus. I especially found the 3D tracking to be probably the most impressive. You have an autofocus box to give yourself some manual control, but as soon as it detects a subject, it'll snap right to it and track its subject as it moves through the frame. Honestly, it's probably better than my Sony A1, which doesn't have the new AI processing chip that Sony has, but it's not better than their newer cameras that do have that chip, like the A7R5 or the A7CR. Like, I was taking some shots of my buddy Johnny's overlanding rig, and it immediately found it through that winding, bendy road and tracked it all along out through the edge of the frame. This set of photos was edited with my Filmic Lightroom preset. I'm working on a new film-inspired preset pack that'll be out soon, but if you go to the link in the description, you can download this one in particular for yourself. It's completely free to download, but it would be super nice if you hit subscribe and play a thumb over with the like button as a free way to say thank you. Now, if you do want to slow down and really get back to your film roots, the Zf does something pretty awesome with respect to manual focus. So let's say you're using a manual lens or you have manual focus enabled. If you also have one of the tracking modes enabled, like eye tracking, it'll actually show you the same autofocus box around the eye and then turn green to indicate when you've nailed the focus. It's honestly probably the closest thing to a digital equivalent of manually focusing with a rangefinder, and it makes me honestly a little bit annoyed that my Leica Q3 doesn't do this, since it now just feels like so obvious that that's the way that it should work. My understanding is that for manual focus lenses, you'd either need to have a native manual lens that has the pin contacts, or you need to use an adapter that has those pins itself. I did a little bit of digging, and something like the TT Artisan 6-bit adapter should do the trick for M-mount lenses, for example. So the Nikon Zf is a shockingly capable video camera, especially for the price point. I'm sure y'all will fact check me on this one, but I'm pretty sure that the Zf is the only Nikon camera that shoots 4K 10-bit log internally without shelling out at least $3,700 for the Z8 or the Z9. So like, sure, there is a pretty big crop factor at 4K 60, but honestly, I'm not too bothered by that, again, given the price point. Similar to the autofocus discussion that we already had, I was really pleasantly surprised with how well autofocus performed on the video front. I'm actually recording this over here on the ZF as a secondary camera as well, so we can see how they are kind of side by side with the FX3. It leans a little bit more magenta on this one, but nothing that can't be accounted for in a color grade, especially because you have 10-bit color. I do have some qualms about the video, so maybe now is a good time to talk about some of the things that I dislike about the ZF. In my mind, if you're gonna put major video specs into a camera, recording interrupted. Why did it do that? Can you record again? This one stopped recording. I think there's a 10-minute limit, yikes. In my mind, if you're gonna put major video specs into a camera, you have to give people the option to use it as a video camera. I understand that fitting a full-size HDMI into a camera can be a little bit difficult size-wise, but I can't express enough how much I hate micro HDMI. They're insanely unreliable, and I've never used one extensively and not had issues. Now, I also know that purists among you probably hate flippy screens, but it really does make the most sense if a camera is gonna have video features like this. If you're gonna add a flippy screen though, you gotta also think about the port positioning, which the Nikon hasn't with this one. Both the micro HDMI and the microphone port are positioned such that the flip screen is kind of rendered useless if you're using either port, because you can't really open the screen without the cables getting in the way. What's worse, let's say you're filming yourself and you want to check the levels. Well, too bad, because the mic cable is going to block the audio levels on the screen. The next thing on my annoyance list is the menu system. Now, I hesitated putting this one in here because maybe I should just chalk it up to this is the first Nikon I've used extensively since the DSLR days. But especially for this being priced as an entry-level cool camera that, let's face it, somewhat is aimed at helping Nikon win over some non-Nikon shooters like myself, they really don't make it easy. Like, why am I going 2/3 of the way down the page until I finally reach the autofocus settings? I think the best, or perhaps worst, illustration of this is with the ISO settings. The combination of the ISO dial and needing to set custom buttons is super frustrating. The ZF makes ISO so complicated that Omar Gonzalez had to put out a 5.5-minute video showing how to switch to auto ISO. I get that menu systems can take some time to get used to, and generally speaking, over the last few months shooting with the ZF, I have figured it out. But for something as fundamental as a piece of the exposure triangle, you should not need a 5.5-minute long video to explain how it works. Another thing that I don't love is the grip. I get that this is meant to be modeled after a retro film camera, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to stick to retro ergonomics. There's a reason we've made improvements to ergonomics over the years. Economics, we might have made some improvements to economics over here. That's a debate. Now, plenty of other everyday carry cameras do have poor ergonomics as well, but none of them are as hefty as the ZF. Admittedly, SmallRig does make a custom grip with an Arca Swiss plate to help remedy this, and it's only $50, but it's still not the best as soon as you add a larger lens, which, let's talk about the lenses. Okay, so I already know that this is gonna ruffle some feathers, but hear me out. The lens selection for the Nikon ZF isn't where it should be. You basically have two native Z-mount lenses that stay true to the small, compact film camera-like shooting experience and still use autofocus. There's the 28mm f2.8 and the 40mm f2. These both fit the body nicely, and they're both decent lenses. They don't have an aperture ring or custom buttons, they're just lenses. They're serviceable, but they don't really help the ZF shine as it should. And like, they're $300 lenses, so we shouldn't really expect them to. But the rest of the Nikon Z mount isn't really a great selection either.
But Cal, the Nikon Z mount is awesome. There's so many incredible lenses. Don't you know about Nikon's history of incredible lenses? Don't you know you can adapt lenses? You're an idiot.
So like, yes, I understand that there is a large selection of Z-mount lenses out there, but attaching any of them to this retro style body makes handling super cumbersome. If we look at the Sony lens ecosystem, on the other hand, there's a whole host of high-end prime and zoom lenses with incredible functionality that fit perfectly with their smaller cameras in the ZV or the A7C lineup. Sure, they're much more expensive, but I personally don't mind shelling out the extra money for a high-end quality compact lens, especially given the ergonomics of the ZF. Yes, I understand that you can adapt older lenses and older glass. And yes, I do enjoy the manual focus feature that we just talked about, but it's the year 2024, not 2016. We shouldn't have to have a stash of adapters just to get a really good quality image. I'll admit I'd like to get my hands on a Z-mount Voigtlander to test, because I do think that that would be a perfect harmony of size, image quality, native mount, and staying true to the manual focus roots that the ZF is emulating, but you're still rendering all of the speed and autofocus and video features kind of useless in that instance. With all this in mind, it begs the question, who is the Nikon ZF actually for? And what is this camera's identity? In my mind, it's a little bit like a teenager going through puberty. You know, it's trying to figure out its place in the world. Who does it want to be when it grows up? Honestly, I think it's still trying to figure itself out. In a way, it's a great everyday carry, but it's also much bigger than like a Ricoh or an X100 series or like a Q series camera. So if size is important, maybe you'd gravitate towards one of those instead. It's kind of a fun, vibey film camera, but it has a flippy screen and video specs that I know the purists are gonna hate. It's got incredible speed and autofocus that allow you to use it as a workhorse camera, but the handling with a larger pro style lens makes it really awkward to hold. But hey, maybe you're just looking for something that sits nicely in this odd Venn diagram of all of those things. At $2,000, it's one of the most capable cameras out there, and I do think it's probably the best combination of having sort of a blast from the past soulful feeling while still having all of the creature comforts of a modern, fast, high-end mirrorless camera. And it does so within a full-frame sensor. Honestly, I hope more brands learn a thing or two from the ZF, because it really is a fun camera, and it proves that not everything needs to be so sterile. So if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, go grab that free preset, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.